Good evening. I'm Philip Gourevitch.
I'm Errol Morris.
He's Errol Morris. Welcome to the 8th Annual New Yorker Festival. I'm a staff writer for The New Yorker. I'm half of tonight's conversation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this festival on behalf of the magazine. This is Errol Morris. He's one of the great nonfiction filmmakers, alive or dead. And
I'll let you decide which case applies here.
I left a blank there. I knew he'd say something. He's made 7 feature-length films. The latest was The Fog of War about Robert McNamara, for which he won a long-overdue Oscar. Before that was Mr. Death, about the electric chair repairman and Holocaust denier Fred Lucher. Before that, it was Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, which is about a lion tamer, a topiary gardener, a mole rat expert, and a designer of robotic insects. Before that was A Brief History of Time about Stephen Hawking and his theories. Before that was The Thin Blue Line, the only film ever to solve a murder and get a man off death row. Before that was Vernon, Florida, a movie so good that I don't think anybody really can say yet what it's about. And that takes us back to where he started in 1980 with Gates of Heaven, which is about pet cemeteries. In case it's not obvious from this list of subjects, Errol is a very funny man. And I've known him for about 15 years. And I think this part of the festival, these writers talk to subjects, is, in our case, it's a little different, which is that I've known him for a long time. I wrote about him when we first met. And about a year and a half ago, Errol started getting in touch with all sorts of material about Abu Ghraib and saying, it's very interesting what I'm working on. And I've started interviewing these people, and I can't stop interviewing, and it's a bit of an affliction. And these people are very interesting, and nobody's really talked to them. And here, let me send you some material. And slowly but surely, he made it clear to me that he had done over 150 hours, it's now almost 200 hours of interviews with the Americans who specifically were involved at Abu Ghraib, including a great many of the people who took and appear in the now iconic photographs of the abuse of Iraqi prisoners at the night shift at Tier 1A in Abu Ghraib. And he said, well, it's a little more than I can really fit into this film. I'm making this film. Maybe you should write a book. So we ended up collaborating since then on a book which will be based entirely or largely on the material that he's generated, which turned out to be in transcript form, over 2.5 million words of interviews. And that's how we come to be here before you tonight. And one of the things that struck me from the beginning, I was absorbed by the voices. I was absorbed by the sense that this material, which is inherently, at the very least, repellent, even as it attracts our attention and troubles us and makes it hard for us to know how to think about it. That from the very beginning, as I was reading these transcripts, they changed my sense of who these barely known but visible people like Lindy England and Charles Grainer and Sabrina Harmon and the others who took and were in the photographs are. And I wondered, what inspired you? What made you? I don't think I've ever asked you this. What kind of made you start thinking, I want to talk to the most reviled American soldiers in the Iraq War?
There's this one idea about art, extending sympathy where it's never been extended before. I think that certainly applies in this instance. There's one thing that almost everybody agrees upon, is that these soldiers from Abu Ghraib, they're sometimes labeled the 7 bad apples. They represent some kind of nadir of the American experience. I got involved in this whole story indirectly because of an interest in photography. In fact, I've been writing about similar issues very recently for the New York Times. The question of when we look at a photograph, we think we know what we're looking at, but do we really know what we're looking at? Does a photograph present information and at the same time hide it? I believe, in fact, that it does. We all have seen the photographs. I don't know, these are probably I don't know how they compare with the raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi or other very, very famous iconic war photographs, but these are some of the most famous photographs ever taken. And in my view, they will become, whether you like it or not, they will become the iconic photographs of this particular war. And yet we know very, very little about them. We know the photographs, we've seen the photographs. We know very, very little about the people who took them. We know very, very little about the circumstances in which they were taken. And we know very, very little about whether these photographs represent all of Abu Ghraib or something that is just one very, very small piece of that place.
Well, that's been, from the get-go, the sort of central, I suppose, partisan divide, but not just partisan. That's been the central kind of question about accountability in these pictures is, are these pictures of individuals acting out on an individual basis as rogues, bad apples, kinky, weird American soldiers gone berserk on the night shift? Or is this actually a window onto and pictures of something that in fact is systemic and that in fact reflects, well, I mean, today, as many of you may be aware, the president again took time out from a public television appearance to say, we Americans do not torture. I have ordered coercive interrogation techniques and I defend this program. The definition of coercive interrogation techniques that we're living with now was borrowed by Justice Department lawyers from a health insurance document not that long before they wrote this. And it basically says that it includes any activity involving the infliction of pain upon a person up to or including organ failure and short of death. So this question exists, and I suppose the centrist position has always been, the broad centrist position, both systemic and individual. If it's systemic, it just sort of excuse or dismiss individual culpability and accountability, and so on. Where do you...
One of the things I've always disliked about these discussions, and I continue to dislike this central feature of discussions about Abu Ghraib in particular, everybody, and I'm sure this is most certainly true of the people in this room, it certainly includes myself, everybody has very, very strong feelings about this war. And yet, it's a war that I think is not well understood, and I think one example of how poorly it is understood is the story of these people at Abu Ghraib and what happened there. What I wanted to do, it's very, very simple, is to investigate. There's nothing more to it than that. Perhaps I'm being disingenuous if I say that I wanted it to be apolitical, because, properly speaking, it can't be apolitical. I have political views about all of this, but to the extent that it was possible for me to do so, I wanted it to be apolitical. I wanted to learn something. I wanted to listen to what these people had to say. I wanted to investigate what actually had happened in this place. Independent of my feelings about this war, I find the war, I'm not disclosing anything that will be at all surprising, I find the war repellent for many, many, many reasons. But independent of those views, to try to investigate and to try to examine what was going on. It's been a very, very difficult film to make, perhaps the most difficult film that I've ever tried to make. And Philip, I should add, has been an enormous asset in all of this, because there's this incredible quantity of material. Ironically, some of it comes from the New Yorker itself. I should mention Jane Mayer and Cy Hirsch as two people who have actually stepped into this morass of material and tried to figure out something about it. The clip I have here, we'll have to figure out how much you really want to see of this. I have 10, 11-minute clip.
3 or 4 days worth of film.
Oh, we could go on forever.
It's all queued up.
Of the death of al-Jamadi. Where did I first read about this? I read about this in the pages of The New Yorker in a piece written by Jane Mayer. The piece was very, very important to me. I think important for many, many reasons. But the story that I've told is a story from the inside out. Her story is a story looking down into this morass. Mine is a story deep inside the morass itself. I think there's some irony, having made this film about one of the most powerful people in government, a guy at the very top of the pyramid, McNamara, that I am making a film now of people who are very, very much at the bottom of all of it. Yeah. Privates, corporals, specialists.
Specialists, a term that, for anybody not acquainted with the military, sounds specialized. And in fact, it is the first rank above private and below sergeant. And it basically means that you're a private for 2 years. And this is also very much what drew me to the material. I mean, when Errol started showing it to me, it was the sense that these are people, this is the story, it's a war story. It's a story of a small group of people whom we know perfectly well and is not denied in the least by anybody, were sent to manage a prison for the management of high-value detainees. They were sent in specific to be the guards on the night shift at a Tier 1A at Abu Ghraib, which is a tier that was taken over by military intelligence, known by its initials in any clips you'll see as MI, where they kept the high-value, so-called high-value detainees, that is, people that they thought had interrogation value. This is all very pertinent if you've been reading the Times in the last couple of days in terms of the policies that they're talking about. And these are the lowest level people you could possibly ask for. This is sort of lower than all quiet on the Western Front type of people. And they were sent in to a hellish prison in hellish conditions at a time when America had implemented a policy of torture, and they're the only people who've ever been asked to account for it or held to account for it. Because, in many ways, in my view, they performed what would, if it was performed by somebody in my profession or Errol's profession, be one of the great scoops of the century. They took photographs, which instead ended up looking like the stupidest, most perverse move in the century. To photograph yourself at crime scenes, to photograph yourself in the perpetration of acts that seem unaccountable. And the idea that we initially had, wait a minute, I'm looking at this thing and these people are doing this and they don't seem to be hiding it. Perhaps that means that they don't think they're doing something wrong, or that, more interestingly, they think they're supposed to do it. Perhaps they don't think they're committing crimes. That idea has been wiped away, and we've been left with the idea that there were individuals who were held to account for their individual actions, and the photographs, which by their narrow frames of excluding what they don't contain, seemed like a window through which we could kind of burrow into this historical moment and look at this policy as it was being implemented and understand what was taking place, became instead a peephole through which it became narrowed. And the expose became the instrument of cover-up. It became the instrument by which the individuals became isolated from any concept of their corporate involvement in a policy. The photograph that is at the center of the current clip is a photograph that was extremely easy and appealing to misread, because it suggested that the person, the American, who appeared behind the Iraqi who was the victim, must inherently be the victimizer. And as you'll see instead, there was a much more interesting story.
I mean, when you look at this clip, think of one question. It's a very simple question. There's a central irony here. What was the crime that these bad apples were charged with in the end? Was the crime the acts of torture that they supposedly had committed? Or was the crime that they had taken pictures and embarrassed the U.S. military, embarrassed
Us.
the administration, embarrassed us, embarrassed America in the eyes of the world? It's one of the things that really fascinates me about this whole story.
Another way of putting it is that for the first time in the history of photography, the iconic photographs of a great historical moment were taken by participants, and the photographers were thrown in jail.
Another aspect of it, yes.
Shall we watch it?
One other thing. I have this theory of ethics, and then I will show you the clip and I will be quiet. My theory of ethics is that ethics is really the combination of two very, very, very strong principles. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry I got caught. And that is very much at play in all of this material. No one really cared about torture, but they did care about photographs being taken that made us collectively look bad.
It's unseemly.
Very bad.
It's unseemly.
Yes, at best. So let's show this clip if we can.
It's the Al-Jamadi clip.
Just a small section from the film, but I thought it made sense to show it here tonight because it embodies some of the central issues of the film. Sabrina Harmon was one of the 7 bad apples. The other, Javal Davis, the African-American, was another of the 7 bad apples. The other soldiers, Frost and Diaz, were never charged with anything at all. In fact, no one above the level of a sergeant ever spent a day in jail in connection with Abu Ghraib.
And as Jane Mayer reported in The New Yorker, the CIA agent, when you hear the phrase OGA, OGA means other government agencies, which is one of those places where an acronym, which is a euphemism for another acronym, is a euphemism. So OGA basically means CIA. And when they speak of ghost detainees, the practice was for other government agencies, 99% of the time CIA, sometimes another sort of government defense agent, intelligence agency, would bring in prisoners without actually registering them through the standard registration process where they'd get a prisoner number and go on the logbooks and so forth, so that the top MP in charge of operations at the prison at that time, Major David Denena, said, they asked me to put out a serious incident report after Al-Jamadi's death, and I couldn't put out a serious incident report because I didn't have a name for him or any other identity. They were ghosts in the literal sense of being brought into a prison, interrogated or treated there.
Well, they in fact would talk about ghost detainees, Al-Jamadi being one of them, people who were not formally logged in and given any kind of identification number, people who essentially could not be tracked by the Red Cross or anyone else for that matter outside of the government. And ghost interrogators as well, a world of ghosts, if you like. People who would show up there from the CIA, from the FBI, from every imaginable government agency, foreign operatives, people from various different client states of the United States, a ghost world, which, of course, was not run in any way by these 7 very, very low-ranked soldiers.
I mean, one has the impression that sort of, perhaps it was my auditory hallucinations, but I felt like the one gasp I heard during this clip was when you see Sabrina with her thumb up. And the impression overwhelmingly amongst people who ever saw these photographs in the kind of random flipping through a magazine or a website would be that Sabrina had somehow was gloating over the death of this man and was somehow probably responsible or associated with it. And
well, I believe it was assumed, in fact,
it was
that she was somehow
it's sort
connected
of like,
with the murder.
This is what pictures seem to indicate. A picture tells... pictures are incapable of telling stories, in fact. Pictures can be evidence of stories, which they invite us to imagine or investigate. Too often we imagine and take the obvious bait. And these pictures were not presented by the photographers who took them with captions that matched to help us be guided, but they were sort of leaked out en masse in a way that we sort of saw them in this kind of confusing jumble, and you saw abuse of one kind and abuse of another kind, you saw a dead guy, and you thought, they killed him. And in fact, it is largely because of the photographs that Sabrina Harmon and the others took of the corpse of al-Jamadi, they were able to actually see evidence of a murder. The case was later deemed a homicide, not when the photographs came out, before the photographs came out, but nevertheless, the story comes together when the story suddenly fits these pictures. And the fact that, as she says, she was lifting off these bandages. Sabrina is somebody who had been training to become a forensic photographer, as it so happens. And
well, one of the many ironies in this story is that I remember recently at a screening someone had said, well, you know, these people talk like children. And I reminded them of the fact they are children. You know, there are children. They are really, really, really young. In Sabrina's case, she had a father and brother who were police officers. She wanted to be a forensic photographer. Oddly enough, she became one sooner than she might have imagined. And from her letters, you see one of the letters in this clip, from her letters that were written from Abu Ghraib, she had stated a number of times her intention to use the photographs to expose the U.S. military.
Here's a letter she wrote 5 days after that event. Al-Jamadi was brought in early in the morning of November 4th, 2003 to the prison. He was captured by Navy SEALs. He may have been somewhat beat up. The autopsy that was finally done on him suggested that he died from asphyxiation because of the way that he was hung during his interrogation and the wounds that he had received prior to the interrogation.
Somewhat beat up. One of the SEALs said that he had had an unfortunate incident with a refrigerator. A refrigerator had fallen on him.
He, by the way, was accused of either bombing the UN or the Red Cross. I'd have to make sure. I mean, just so you know, it was, unlike 99% of the arrests at Abu Ghraib, not totally random. But in this case, he was brought in on the 4th of November, and he was, at 11 o'clock that night, another series of extremely famous photographs were taken, which are the hooded man with electrical wires on the MRE box, a prisoner who was generally known. His name was Saad Abdufale, but he was known by the nickname of Gilligan. He was photographed. The famous photographs of the man on the box and the hood were taken between 11 and 11:10 a.m. The first photographs, those were taken by the cameras of Sabrina Harmon and Ivan Chip Frederick. And by 11:27, she was in al-Jamadi's shower stall next door taking the first photos of al-Jamadi's corpse. Then she went back to Gilligan for a while and was back for the second session with al-Jamadi at 1:20 a.m. The extent to which this was, in other words, an incredibly compressed and febrile and strange place is sort of spoken of there. And she wrote a letter on the 9th of November to her wife, as she called her, Kelly. I haven't slept all night. This is a few days later, and just as she's about to go home on leave. I just can't sleep. 6 prisoners escaped last night. We did a sweep, but no luck in finding them. They're smart. That's 8 we've lost in 3 nights. Something bad is going to happen here. I'm leaving to come home in about 3.5 hours. I'm not sure how to feel. I have a lot of anxiety. I think something is going to happen, either to me not making it or you doing something wrong. I think too much. I hope I'm wrong, but if not, know that I love you, and you are and always will be my wife. I hate to be so scared. I hate anxiety. I hate the unknown. We might be under investigation. I'm not sure. There's talk about it. Yes, they do beat the prisoners up, and I've written this to you before. I just don't think it's right and never have. That's why I take the pictures, to prove the story I tell people. No one would ever believe the shit that goes on. No one. The dead guy didn't bother me. I even took a picture with him doing the thumbs up, but that's when I realized it wasn't funny anymore, that this guy had blood in his nose. I didn't even have to check his ears. I already knew it was not a heart attack they claimed he died of. He bled to death from some cause of trauma to his head. I was told when they took him out, they put an IV in him and put him on a stretcher like he was alive to fool the people around. They said the autopsy came back heart attack. It's a lie. The whole military is nothing but lies. They cover up too much. This guy was never in our prison. That's the story. The fucked up thing was, we never touched this guy. As soon as they released him to us, he died only a few minutes later. If I want to keep taking pictures of the events, I even have short films. I have to fake a smile every time. I hope I don't get in trouble for something I haven't done. I'm going to try to burn these pictures and send them out to you while I'm in Kuwait. Just in case. I love you and hope you to see you in the next day. Your wife, Sabrina.
Yeah. One important thing to remember about this particular case, among many things, is that none of the Navy SEALs, none of the CIA operatives, none of the military intelligence personnel ever spent a day in jail in connection with his death.
They were identified. They have been identified, by the way, and they've been questioned.
Sabrina Harmon, on the other hand, was initially charged in connection with al-Jamadi. If it was not brought into her court-martial, it was only, I believe, because of the fear, the understandable fear on the part of the U.S. military, that by bringing it up, they were making themselves look very, very, very bad. I have this, I would have to call it a perverse theory. A number of my theories are perverse theories, and I pretty much know that Philip does not agree with it, but I'll run it by you anyway. I think I've set that up well. Everybody says, of course, that the Abu Ghraib photographs, the 7 bad apples, were a disaster for this country, a disaster for America. I actually believe that they helped.
I said this to you before you ever said it. What are you talking about?
You always disagreed with me about this.
Well, of course.
This is, by the way, a theory, a perverse theory that Philip completely endorses. I misspoke a moment ago.
Completely.
The theory, did I get this completely wrong?
No, you got the theory right. It's the frame that's wrong. It's just like your view of pictures.
It's like photography.
Yeah.
That the 7 bad apples, that Abu Ghraib, the scandal of the photographs, helped George W. Bush win the 2004 election.
Oh, no, I don't agree with that. I think that it was good.
Well, see, let me finish, because you've already flip-flopped. How
it was
is
better for him than that, is what I think.
Okay, give me a second. The first reaction is, how could that possibly be the case? Here's how. That it gave him someone to blame. If the war is senseless, purposeless, going south, the insurgency is increasing, whose fault is it? somehow these 7 bad apples, I believe, took the stain of the entire war. It didn't matter whether you were left or right. I think it's apolitical in this sense, that they are at the heart of the darkness, if you like. It's as if those photographs, which are trying to tell some kind of story, became used to tell a very, very different kind of story. They were subverted for political purposes and served a very powerful political end.
Well, here's how I would put it slightly differently.
What were you agreeing with?
What I was agreeing with is that the photographs were excellent for George Bush. Because essentially they are by far and away not the worst things that were done in the war in terms of either torture or horror or abuse of human life in general. And that they created a kind, because these, I mean, there's a great big tension in these photographs between the great puzzle that they are these the photographs of participants, that they allow us this inside-out window on something that no photojournalist, no journalist could ever even get close enough to do an expose, and at the same time they are posed. And they include soldiers who are posing in sort of trophy positions and who are grinning or leering or appear either foolishly or sort of sinisterly to be taking some kind of pleasure in being photographed. There's a bold self-presentation of the camera, which is mystifying. The sort of tendency has been to say, where's the smoking gun at Abu Ghraib? How do we pin this to Rumsfeld? How do we pin this to... There are a variety of names.
It's always been one of Philip's best lines about this whole story. When I first started working on this, and I've been involved in it for now a good part of 2 years. The question that would be repeated again and again and again to me is, have you found the smoking gun? Have you found the smoking gun? Have you found the smoking gun? As if the only possible reason that I could be interested in this material is to find the smoking gun that leads to the White House.
Yeah, sort of, you know, dear Charles Grainer, strip 'em and stack 'em, love Don Rumsfeld. As if that were needed.
Yeah, the fantasy was the record of the video conference call where Rumsfeld says to someone at Abu Ghraib, you ever think of stacking them in a pyramid? I don't believe that such a document exists. I don't believe such a conversation occurred. Philip's line, if I may quote you, is properly considered Abu Ghraib is the smoking gun. And I think it does capture in many, many ways the essence of this story. Everybody knows things about this administration. It's the things that we don't know that interest me. To make yet one more film to talk about the chain of command, the set of legal decisions that were made. Not that this work is not valuable. On the contrary, I believe it's all valuable. But to make one more movie, to write one more article about it, interested me less than actually heading into uncharted territory.
I think these photographs, by the way, in terms of iconic photographs, are bookends to the most witnessed events in human history in real time, which was 9/11. And I think that there's a kind of way in which these photographs have been seen by more people. And also, there's that strange aspect to the amateurism and the crudeness and the participant nature of these photographs that at a time when we basically increasingly distrust images and imagine that everything is somehow spin, that it's either pro-war propaganda or anti-war propaganda, that there is a kind of partisan divide on which everybody must fall, that these things sort of fall into some crack between those two poles. And I think that it's very interesting that this prison becomes a kind of microcosm of a war. I mean, if we wanted to watch another clip, one of the great pressures, you should know, on the prison, we're talking about a very short period of time, a period of roughly 100 days, less than 100 days, between October 15th and January 13th, roughly, of 2003-04, when all of these photographs were taken and when these people were there. And
it's a very, very short period of time.
Incredibly short. And the pressure was intense to find Saddam, find Saddam, find Saddam. I mean, do you want to watch another clip about Saddam?
Yeah, I should say something a little bit about this. When I started interviewing people, I have a very, very bad interviewing habit. I wish they would devise some kind of 12-step program for withdrawal from interviewing. It becomes a kind of compulsion that is very difficult to curb. I used to work in, the interviews were shot in 35 or 16 millimeter film, and 16 it's 400 feet, and 35 it's 1,000 feet. It's 11 minutes in both cases. So you would have to stop every 11 minutes, reload the camera, reslate, so on and so forth. The film was shot in 35. All of the interviews were shot using high-end, high-def digital video, which means that I can shoot forever and never, ever, ever stop.
And I get carpal tunnel.
Yes. The first person I interviewed was Janis Karpinski, the brigadier general who was demoted by George Bush, first fired from command, then demoted. I brought her in to see if I really wanted to make this movie. Sort of it's sticking your toe in the water. And I did a 17-hour interview with Janis Karpinski over 2 days. I don't believe it was torture in and of itself, because she was free to go at any time.
But she refused to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I've always prided myself on my bladder. And she
stared him down.
Sit there for 5-6 hours, 7 hours, never get up. I would ask for a break. I would walk around. She would sit bolt upright in this chair, waiting for me to return. I was fascinated by her then, and I remain fascinated by her now. I find her to be an extraordinarily interesting character. Like many of the other characters, embodying so many of the contradictions of this story. I believe the clip that I have a couple of clips, I'll show them to you. These were done very near the end of the interview, where I think perhaps both of us started to go insane.
This is not at present, shall I say. This is a special peek at something that's not in the movie.
Yeah, well, the movie is still in flux. I'm supposed to finish it one of these days, but this is currently...
Take your time.
Not in the movie. And Janis is addressing this question, one of the questions, of course. I thought it was put by her very powerfully. If she was considered to be so incompetent, why is it that she was given custody of prisoner number one? Why did she become Saddam Hussein's jailer?
So if there's a Janis Karpinski clip, let's roll it.
Please.
In the beginning of the war, one of the first widely publicized events was the ambush of the National Guard unit. And Jessica Lynch was part of that convoy that was ambushed. And she was captured, she was taken as a prisoner of war, and she was released and became the face of the war. This blue-eyed, fair-skinned, blonde soldier. Women were right there in the middle of the action. Women were on the battlefield. I don't think the Pentagon or this administration wanted Jessica Lynch to become the face of the war. it would have encouraged other women to step up, to volunteer, to join, and to go and do the same things. They needed to show the dark side of women's performance. So they balanced, they countered the Jessica Lynch publicity with the new face of the war. It was Lindy England, and it was me. Saddam was transferred to us without incident. Several days later, I went to visit him. I said, I can't give you anything, but I can pass along your request. And he said, yes, he wanted fruit. So I looked down on the small table next to his bunk, and there was a bowl with apples and oranges in it. So he saw me look down, and he said, no, not oranges and apples. He wanted bananas and apricots. He asked me, you're in the Army? I told him, yes, I was, and yes, I was a general. He said, wallahi, one day we will have this in my country. My country. He hadn't resigned himself to the truth or the reality that he was now under control of the U.S. forces, and it was no longer his country. He was not dealing with the reality of the situation. He knew where he was, and his cell was by no stretch of the imagination a luxury. And he's asking for bananas and apricots because he thinks he's entitled. He said, I do have another request, my glasses. And he was holding them in his hand. He said, my glasses, it's not clear. And I said, these are not your glasses? He said, no, these are my glasses. But the glass, it's not right. I looked at the glasses. I didn't take them from him, but I looked at them, and it didn't appear that they were scratched or broken or anything, so I wasn't sure what he was telling me. But when I said to his handlers, he asked for his glasses, but he said they were his glasses, but the glass was wrong. And he said, yeah, he's right. The glass is wrong. You start from the very basics. Comfort zone is affected. Not comfort zone by torturing or beating, but comfort zone by not having the same ability you had when you were not imprisoned. I could see clearly with my glasses before. I can't see clearly with my glasses now. And it was important to him to be able to read the Quran. When he was arrested, they took his glasses, checked them to make sure that they weren't wired, I'm sure, and recognized that this was an opportunity to affect a very basic level of a comfort zone. So you change out the prescription. It's not as clear as it was before. We'll take a look at your glasses if you will help us. That's not torture, obviously, but you're affecting the comfort zone. You're building confidence and trust. So from a very basic level, that indicates how many layers of distrust they were facing.
But don't you tell him that? You're being punished. Now, if you want a better prescription, you, sir, behave yourself.
No.
Explain this to me.
I'm not an interrogator, but I can tell you that they didn't offer any explanations for any of their actions. Any of their actions. For a person as powerful as Saddam was, he would likely look at that as being submissive. If you did that, don't tell me. If you put poison in my fruit, don't tell me. Don't tell me because you're showing your hand. Saddam likely knew that they changed out his lenses, but they weren't going to confirm or deny it. What they did say was, you're having a problem with your glasses? We'll have the doctor check you out, and we'll take your glasses, and we'll see if we can help you on that. And then they bring back a pair where he can see clearly again. That was very nice of them. You can't help but think that. I really wasn't sure if he would even engage in conversation with me. And I think it was more out of curiosity than anything else. He asked me, are you really a general? Are you really in the Army? I just responded that, yes, I am a general, and yes, I am in the Army, and these are my soldiers.
And he is your prisoner.
I never said that to him. But he was. And he was turned over to me, to my control, to the 800th MP Brigade. So if a week later you, General Sanchez, are going to sign a letter saying you had doubts about my abilities to lead and to command, why would you turn over the #1 guy in Iraq to my control?
One reason why I brought Philip into all of this is that many reasons. The incredible amount of material, the idea that it would be interesting to have
me as backhoe.
Someone to take a different path through a lot of this. This is not currently, none of this material is in the movie. I think there's an amazing quantity of material, literally dozens and dozens of hours, which I wish I could find a way to put out in some form. I think it's very, very strong and very interesting. I find this clip from Janice Karpinski very, very strong and very, very interesting. The whole idea that in order to show strength, one has to cloak one's entire motivation, and maybe even the fact that one might not have one.
Well, I also like in there the fact that Saddam refers to it as his country. She says, like, he didn't understand. And I can't help thinking, yes, he did. That on some deep level, he might have lost his office and he might be about to lose his life. But it had been his country more than it would be anybody else's who was taking it from him. And that's part of what's twisted about this story and part of what she gets at. Also, this whole blurring of vision, the whole deliberate messing with somebody's vision. I also like this clip, and it's important. I mean, it starts out with this rather peculiar self and melodramatic and the kind of old-fashioned Hollywood melodrama, even the kind of growing intensity of the voice, it's me, that of the sort of melodrama of herself as the dark Jessica Lynch, you know. She and Lindy England, the lowest possible ranking soldier, and herself the highest soldier who was humiliated in this whole punishment over Abu Ghraib. And one of the things that's very striking throughout this whole story is the presence and prevalence and complexity of the roles of women in the story. And it's central to the story. The humiliation of American women to humiliate Iraqi soldiers, to use them as pointers at naked men, as there's this rather strange notion.
One more grotesque irony in the story.
Throughout the interviews, you get this strange stuff, a lot of which comes up in the psychiatrist documents about Abu Ghraib, that people will constantly tell you, well, it's an Arab culture thing. In Arab culture, it's considered highly humiliating to be stripped naked and paraded in public, particularly in front of women or dogs that are biting at your genital area. This insight took hold and proved in fact to register fear.
Yeah, there are reports about how Iraqi men, stripped naked, are afraid of underfed Rottweilers.
Yeah.
Go figure.
So this was somehow considered some sort of weirdness of the local population. And it was exploited, but the only way to exploit it is to treat women like dogs to some extent, and to have them out there, snapping and snarling. And one of the things that you get from Janice Karpinski, and I mentioned her bladder earlier because it's related, and you get it from each one of these women in a very different way, and it's very interesting, is the desire to be tough and the kind of constant concern about, if I'm having qualms about this, does it mean I'm not tough enough? Sabrina,
certainly
whom you saw earlier.
Sabrina's letters,
it comes up a
constant
lot.
Theme.
And at one point she sort of explains that, she has this aspiration to be a forensic photographer, and she has this sort of uncommon, she's known as somebody who kind of is totally comfortable looking at corpses and the dead, and visits morgues wherever she goes. But she can't stand seeing people hit. She doesn't like violence. And a lot of what they were being asked to do was, take things away from prisoners, take away their mattresses, make forced sleep deprivation, physical discomforts of various kind, which was a kind of negative reward system. That is to say that you would re-bestow these things on them if they were cooperating. And she said, I was a bad soldier. I was always slipping these things to them.
Beyond that, stress positions. Stress positions which are...
being hung in various ways off the bars by...
really properly considered torture. I can't think of any better way to describe them. You have a litany of things that no one really has attended to about this place.
I don't think it's giving anything away to explain that the exculpation of many of the things that you see in photographs in trials is where we got our title from, standard operating procedure.
Yes.
There are many, many things that you see in those photographs that were judged to be not criminal. Because they weren't criminal. They were policy. They were universal, and there was no ambiguity about it. And I think that it's really interesting because Errol actually, in his interview with Sabrina at one point, he says, well, why do you think, leaving aside why you weren't so into doing these things, why do you think others were? And she said, maybe they were more patriotic. And he said, well, what do you mean patriotic? And she says, well, they were told this is for the collective security. This guy's a terrorist. This guy's threatening our lives and your lives. And I guess I wasn't a very good patriot. And there is no irony detectable in the way that she's saying this. This is not a sort of double entendre or a way of kind of sneaking a dig at them. It's a completely straightforward statement. There is the feeling that in some way she fell short in her discomfort.
It's also interesting that if you ask people, I think that there would be some agreement about this. The truly iconic photographs, there are probably 4 of them from Abu Ghraib. You can correct me if I'm wrong. There's the hooded man on the box with wires, Gilligan on the box with wires. There's Lindy England with a leash that's attached to a man's neck, Gus. There's the pyramid, as the photo investigator calls it, the infamous 7-man naked Iraqi stacking, a title that Philip at one point suggested a title for the movie.
The movie people said, well, why don't you use it for the book?
There's the picture of Lindy with the cigarette dangling out of the corner of her mouth, pointing at this naked Iraqi who is either masturbating or just simply holding his penis. These pictures became kind of these emblematic, these iconic pictures. What's really also interesting to me is there were many hundreds of these photographs, by the way. In fact, there are many hundreds of the photographs that were eventually publicly released that people have seen. Why the attention became focused on these four photographs?
Well, with the exception of Gilligan, they've got American women. It's humiliating. I mean, there's a sensational, often pornographic component to them.
There are pictures taken by male soldiers of American women dominating Iraqi prisoners. There's something very strange and appalling about them. Still, what fascinates me, and still fascinates me, by the way, if I give the impression that I have some deep understanding of all of this, I don't think I do. I think the more that I know about it, the more perplexing I find all of it. I see certain themes, I can say certain things, but there's some very deep and dark mystery here that remains. But the attention was focused on those four pictures, say, and all the pictures of torture, what I would consider to be real torture, people standing in pools of their own urine, deprived of food, deprived of sleep.
Often alone in these pictures. These pictures are not the pictures where you see American soldiers posing, but a sort of a solid, just a person. They look more like what you'd think of as conventional documentary photographs. They're snapped by a soldier of somebody in a position that wasn't sort of performed for the camera, and they're desolate beyond comparison.
People with panties on their heads, in stress positions, basically in pretzel positions. Excruciating, contorted positions from which they can't move. As these interviews progressed, and I heard more and more, there's stories of kidnapping, extortion, children imprisoned indefinitely at Abu Ghraib.
Adjacent to this wing that we're talking about, 1A, are women who've been kidnapped, kidnapped literally, seized by American forces, thrown in jail because they are married to somebody who is being looked for. It's illegal in any system. Children under the age of 16, much less 18, kept in this prison.
We have these
in our name.
Finicky discussions about Geneva Conventions. Does the Geneva Convention apply to this group of people, that group of people, so on and so forth? What's so interesting about Abu Ghraib to me is that everything there was a violation of the Geneva Conventions. The very fact of its existence.
There's a basic thing, I think it's in the third Geneva Convention, it's in the 20s, it may be 22, 24, 26 thing, which basically says, at their capture, prisoners who are covered by this convention must be moved out of any combat zone. To keep a prisoner who is not in danger of his life by transportation in a danger zone any longer than a day is in itself a violation of this convention, or maybe it's 2 days. This was the most attacked American base in Iraq during the period that these people were kept there. And one of the legal fictions of this period, you may think that the May 1st declaration by the president on the aircraft carrier that major combat operations had ended was merely a campaign period photo op. But in fact, it's a redefinition of the theater of war. During a war, you're fighting against an enemy power, and if you capture their people, they're enemy POWs, and there are all kinds of rules that apply, but they're never going to be charged with a crime. They're simply treated as enemy combatants, enemy assets that you're neutralizing. You remove them to the rear, and as soon as combat's over, you release them. And believe it or not, in May 1 of 2003, a lot of them were released, and a lot of them were kept as security detainees, this fictitious word for prisoners. And it's a euphemism. And the reason that they were able to keep them in Abu Ghraib is because, of course, you can't have a combat zone in a non-combat zone. And you can't have enemy prisoners of war to whom you apply prisoner of war doctrine in a place where there is no enemy power and where there is no alternate army. So you can't say to whom they belong. So they must be insurgents. Insurgents against what? There isn't an Iraqi government. So it's a very complicated legal status, and it's these loopholes that are being exploited for simply rounding people up and tossing them in there. Should we take some questions?
Yeah, one last point is, and it remains as a question for me. We became focused, and I say by we, I mean we, probably people around the world, people certainly in this country, we became obsessed, focused on these 4 photographs. And yet there was a world, a veritable world of abuse that remained unseen and unspoken about. And I think that it's important to make that world visible.